Hi, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome to another edition of Book Story, a digital book club for history lovers. And Book Story is brought to you by Backstory, an American history podcast. And as always, I'm your host, Melissa Gismondi. So back in December, I decided to feature a book that came out some time ago. It was published in 1995, but was such a great fit for the holiday season. And so the book was this one, Christmas in America. Hopefully you can see that with the light, a history. And the author I'm really excited to have with us here is Penny Riestad. Hello, Penny.
Hi there.
And Penny is a distinguished senior lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Texas at Austin. Her scholarship considers the development of American cultural identities, including the development of American consumer culture. So thanks so much for being with us here today, Penny.
Nice to be here.
So to start off, I just kind of thought we could kick off the discussion by, it is such an interesting, and on the one hand, it's such an interesting idea for a book. And what made you decide that you wanted to write this book? Was there a particular thing that happened, or what kind of made you interested in the history of Christmas?
I don't know. I that the short version is I'm sitting in my living room and I've got a fireplace, and on one side was my aunt's ceramic Christmas tree, the green kind that's ceramic with the light in it.
Yes, yes.
I got that one on one side, and on the other side of the fireplace was a menorah, because my husband's Jewish. And so I'm thinking this is kind of strange. I have never really thought about Christmas because I'd always, it's just in the air you breathe. It was a cultural norm. It's just what I never thought about it. And I think that in the 90s, historians were starting to look at a number of things, and I'm trying to think of an example, but that were everyday kinds of ideas or actions, and kind of realizing that it was carrying culture. And I think this is sort of a result of, I would say this is a result of probably something that started to break out in the 1970s, and that is that awareness that there were different histories in America, not a single one. So that was a short answer.
So awareness, can you say a little bit more about that? Awareness that there were different histories of America. And so what was the kind of link for you from that to Christmas in particular?
Well, it's just one of those things you go down the street, and all the houses have lights on them. There are Christmas trees in everyone's front window, and then there are a couple of places that are notoriously dark at Christmas. And I'm just was aware that was one of those. It was, as much as anything, an admission to my own cultural biases and blind sides. I have a good friend who has a very large picture window, and she is Jewish. And she was telling me this neighbor came across the street and said, "Why don't you have a Christmas tree in your window?" And she said, "Well, I'm Jewish." And the woman says, "Yes, but it's America." And this was, I'd never thought about associating this as a patriotic statement, or that this would cause cultural conflicts of any sort, or there would be assumptions that what we practice, we as a culture practice, may have some other meanings for people who weren't brought up in a Christian tradition. So yeah, it's just that kind of, like I said, I think it's my own cultural blind side that got revealed.
So I'll pick up on that point I think that you made about the idea of Christmas is linked to patriotism. But before we get to that, I do want to ask, have had a lot of historians written about Christmas, or was it, you know, new, fresh ground to tread, so to speak, where there was, you know, a lot to say, and there hadn't been much that had been written before?
There was a book in the mid 50s that said a little bit about American Christmas. There were a number of books that, well, not even a number of books, a few books that had to do with the traditions of Christmas. You know, where did this carol come from, and why is it the candy canes are striped? And and I don't have any answers to any of those questions. But at the same time, I was writing this book. Uh, Steve Nissenbaum wrote to me and said, "I understand you're writing a history of Christmas." And he was curious about what I was writing, because it turned out at the same time he was writing a book about Christmas. And we had two different viewpoints and completely compatible on that. But awareness had hit him at the same time. Um, Eric Schmidt also was writing a book called Consumer Rights at the same time. It's almost, you know, sometimes there are things that just happen in the air and everyone kind of hits the same ideas simultaneously. Since then, there have been several really good books written about Christmas, but I think that the three of us kind of began this new interrogation in the 90s.
Do you think it was something about in the 90s? Was it, I know there was kind of increased discussion of, you know, as there often is, increased discussion of what Christmas means in America, of, you know, the quote unquote war on Christmas. Was that part of what was in the news that you think maybe was kind of, in addition to maybe historians were starting to explore things like culture and write histories of culture more than they had before?
So that is when, so we were starting in the midst of what actually got labeled the culture wars. But this doesn't seem to be coming out of an awareness of a cultural war. It's more of, I think it was a gentler exploration as, oh, there are different ways of carrying culture, and that Christmas has been one of those traditions that's very complicated, very nuanced, very layered, and that one can participate in it from various angles. You know, you can enter it through a shop, you can enter it through a church, you can enter it through home, you can enter it through, I don't know, a Chinese restaurant, which is like another tradition. So my thought is that people were, that the way that we were starting to think about Christmas was an exploration of, Kwanzaa, for instance, you know, those sort of different groups of people were starting to say, well, I've got you know, something that I want to kind of stake a claim within the culture, but it didn't seem contentious.
Mm-hmm.
Increasingly, it's become contentious, and now it's you know, you don't automatically say Merry Christmas. You size up the person, and you think, well, if I say that to them, am I making an aggressive statement, or am I making a cheerful statement, or am I making it cheerfully and they're accepting it as an aggression? I mean, there's so much extra thinking that has to go into something that, let's say, in 1952 went unexamined.
So, and we'll pick up on that later on towards the end, but you mentioned that there's so many nuances and complexities to Christmas, and naturally then the history of Christmas. So I want to get into some of that. And a major theme in your book is how Christmas worked to kind of unify the United States, which has always been multicultural and lots of ethnicities and races of people living there, but became increasingly more so in the 19th century. So can you tell us a little bit about how Christmas helped create a sense of national unity at that time, despite the fact that, some Americans weren't Christian.
Well, most Americans were Christian, so that's a starting point. Um, and and let me see, what else do I want to say about that? I'm trying to think about where to begin this answer, and I'm kind of thinking that it starts in the creation of multiplicities of Protestantism in the early 19th century. So more Methodists, more Baptists, and then different types of Baptists and different types of Methodists and Church of Christ, and we'll go on the way in which there's just a blossoming of types of Protestantism, but they're all Protestant. Mm-hmm. And this is not to put aside Catholics by any means, except they weren't a very sizable percentage of the population, and other religions. That this is definitely a culture that had as a commonality Protestantism. But the Protestantism, there's lots of tensions within that. And so I think that's one strand, is that you start to see in the beginnings of Christmas, say in 1820s and 30s, a way in which people, there are these really interesting examples like Ezra Stiles, who is not celebrating Christmas. So there are a lot of Protestants who do not celebrate Christmas at all at the time. And you find him in his diary, I have this sense as he's confessing he sneaked over to an Episcopalian church because it's so pretty at Christmas.
And mention to those who don't know who Ezra Stiles was.
He's a Puritan minister, Puritan. I mean, I sort of like one of the true sort of descendants of the Puritan idea that if it's not in the Bible, we're not going to do this. And there's no reference to celebrating Christmas in the Bible. And so Puritan descendants, Congregationalists, Presbyterians didn't celebrate Christmas. That's something you just didn't do. But he was really attracted to the sensuality of it, the smell of the fir and the candles and the hymns. And so I found numbers of people who would admit in their diaries that they kind of made some allowances for other traditions where, day in and day out would say, I'd never go near an Episcopalian. Christmas, it's different. So there's that one kind of crossover part that's Christmas, that has to do with with the beauty of it, with just the visuality in the middle of winter and those sorts of things. There's another part too, which is a beginning of a middle class. And I may be wrong, but I know that families start to get middle class families and urban middle class families start to get a little bit smaller, and they can start to spend more resources, which awful word, on their children, and indulge their children. The children, there's better chance that they're going to live longer, and they don't have to go out on the farm and work hard. And so there's a preciousness about childhood. And I think that translates into baby Jesus, that you can start to celebrate Jesus, or not religion as God-centered, but Protestantism as centered on Jesus as the Son of Man. And so there's a real humanizing of the whole nativity. So what's happening with religion is also happening in the home. And the home is becoming this place that is, if a woman's lucky enough, is living in a nice home, and is mostly charged with keeping a nice home. And there are all sorts of problems with that statement about, like, do you want to be that kind of woman? But this is a point of privilege. And so for women, if anybody probably who created Christmas, it was most likely women. And my flippant comment would be they created Christmas so there was something to do during the middle of the winter. that you know, like let's drag in a tree and let's put popcorn strings on it, and the children anticipate it, and it becomes a focal point of winter. And most of this happens, you know, in places like in the Northeast, and in cities mostly.
So you mentioned Ezra Stiles, which is, I think, he's a great kind of segue to this broader debate that you talk about of how a lot of settlers and then, early Americans are Christians, but most of them don't really celebrate Christmas. And there's a tension throughout the book that you describe of, linking up to this theme of patriotism. Is Thanksgiving going to be the kind of national American holiday, or is Christmas?
Nope.
So can you tell us a little bit about how, where that debate came from, why people like Ezra Stiles, who kind of had to secretly like Christmas, and why that debate existed, and why Christmas ultimately won out, in your opinion?
So the first thing is that also, let's say in the 1820s, 1810s, the Americans don't have a calendar, and it's very sparse. And what I'm saying by they don't have a calendar is that different groups of people keep different calendars and keep and pinpoint different things on it. So when after the American Revolution, all the British holidays had to be taken off, of course. So that stripped off the calendar. The Puritan tradition is you've got Sunday, and that's what you've got. And the rest of the days you work and work and work. Um, then if you want to talk, there are local holidays that people would have, but these are not national. It's something that someone celebrates in Maine is completely strange to someone in South Carolina. So the question starts to be how is it that you start to develop a Christmas tradition? So the place that you're really starting to target is somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. If you're going to have, okay, so you're in Canada right now. So tell me when Thanksgiving is in Canada.
Well, in Canada, Thanksgiving is after the first weekend of October. So it's kind of like a harvest.
Totally wrong. It's a harvest festival, right? And I'm sitting here in Austin, Texas, and there are still leaves on the tree. So we kind of think about so that might be a better time. So because it's so tied to an end of a season, it it wasn't having this sort of resonance. There's a woman, Sarah Josepha Hale, I think I've got the right woman, who really wanted to have a national Thanksgiving Day, and she really urged Abraham Lincoln to do this. And he actually did declare a Thanksgiving Day in 1863. Um, but if you're a Southerner and you're in the middle of the Civil War, that's not going to be quite the holiday you want to celebrate either. So it had some tensions over that. It's seasonal, it's regional, and also set in the middle of a civil war doesn't quite work as well. But if you don't look at the political differences, so North and South in that, but can instead look at the religious similarities, actually they become something of a bind, but something that binds people. But we're still not talking about specific religion or specific beliefs like what we do as Baptists or what we do as Mennonites, not looking at that. Instead, looking at those those routines that are just pleasurable. So let's go back to "'Twas the Night Before Christmas Went All Through the House." That's just a bit of doggerel poem that Clement Clarke Moore apparently wrote for his family in New York, got picked up by newspapers, and it set a it set a tableau. So if it's Christmas and you want to do, so you're not, you may go to church, you may go to any number of churches, but instead, uh, this adds something else. So let's hang up the stockings with care. Let's wait for this character who's going to sneak around and come down the chimney and be lively and quick. And so you can find, for instance, in diaries, in Southern diaries, that people have children have hung up their stockings on the staircase, but they're reading the night before Christmas, and it's almost a literary tradition that becomes a unifying idea rather than religion. So religion, when I said it was nuanced, so religion might kind of introduce a part of Christmas, but there's also a very appealing home set of rituals that are associated with it. And that comes through newspapers and repetition of people enacting a poem.
So would you say it's that emphasis on maybe on children? And as you said earlier, the 19th century is when there's the domestic sphere, there's greater attention on parenting children, there's manuals,
Yeah.
all of that's going on. But then also that Christmas is kind of fun, and there's that
Yeah.
it's the fun aspect to it that maybe makes it more appealing than Thanksgiving.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because you can focus all on the children. And at the, again, I'm kind of stuck in the 1820s and 30s. And you think about what you can do for children. And then actually a piece of candy would be a treat. Um, some tinsel, or I guess there wouldn't be tinsel, but there'd be, berries or something, or handmade ornaments. And the idea even of a Christmas tree is a pretty dramatically unique thing that we don't really start seeing it until the 1840s. But there are all these traditions that are pulled together from all these various peoples that come to the United States, and they pull in their own traditions and pull from other people's traditions from seeing the people around them. And it kind of gets kind of cobbled together as a national holiday because it has these kind of has openings for one's own heritage, but it also has openings to adopt other people's practices.
So there's that fluidity within it where you can kind of adapt it.
Yeah, you can kind of pick and choose, do you open your presents on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning? Um, is there church involved or not involved? There are all these sorts of questions that can be crafted to a family.
So you mentioned a couple times Christmas in the South, and I do want to make sure I get in. We have a question from one of our readers, Vicky, and Vicky wants to know if a majority of slave owners gave their enslaved workers time off for Christmas. But then she asks, and this is a direct quote here from Vicky, would that proportion be skewed by what is most likely many more written accounts of slave owners portraying themselves in a positive light versus the amount of literate slaves who were able to describe their treatment on Christmas?
Okay. Vicky is suspicious. um, Definitely, the accounts we've got are, Mary Chestnut and, women diarists primarily. William Gilmore Simms, who wrote some uh, stories about Christmas. So, yeah, the owners, the Southerners, are trying to portray themselves in a positive light, but there's a longstanding tradition about. I'm trying to think of a phrase that is more is better than buying off, but in England, in there was a long-standing tradition in the South, much more than the North, is attuned to keeping uh, keeping continuity with the English past. And I'm talking in the 19th century. And there's a long tradition in among the peerage in England, in the countryside, of bringing the servants inside, and for that one day, the masters serve the servant. It is a reversal. So one of the long-standing themes about Christmas is reversals, where you act opposite. I mean, look at Santa Claus. Here's someone who gives rather than takes. The emphasis on uh, just generosity in general in a nation that is capitalistic and competitive. So this idea in the that's rooted in the English tradition is that if you give something out, or if you allow some generosity through this in this ritualized moment, it will help calm. Antipathy is the least word, but the tendency to want to be angry about one's status, about being enslaved. So it's a buying off. It's a like, oh, but Mass is being really nice to me. I got this new kerchief, and then be, so one of the you learn this from Frederick Douglass, is that enslaved people would compare masters with each other, and they'd be sources of pride. So if your master gave you a new kerchief or an extra serving of molasses, this is a matter of pride, and then it actually increases fidelity to the master. And as we get into the antebellum period, the more that the master can do to quell unhappiness, potential rebellion, that this is just one of those strategies. So it's a crafty strategy.
And Frederick Douglass was offered, right, a pretty scathing critique then of the celebration of Christmas for this very reason, that it works to kind of to serve, it's eventually serves the owner's purposes by kind of quelling any possibility of resistance.
Absolutely. And it gives that illusion of equality. Oh, look, we're reversing places, and it's highly suspect. I think Vicki is exactly right.
So I want to get into, which is, I think, maybe one of the big things that people might think about with the history of Christmas, and where this figure of Santa Claus comes from, which is a long history. But can you tell us a little bit about the development of a distinct American Santa Claus?
Clement Clark Moore, I think, is just really important because he gives us something for Santa Claus to do. And if there's one thing in American identity, it's always Americans are doing things. They're not just sitting there contemplating, or there's not a passivity. So here's a little old driver so lively and quick that is imagined by Clement Clark Moore, and Washington Irving helps him a little bit. I mean, this is a group of New Yorkers. Again, just to put a time reference here, in the 1810s, that there's a group of New Yorkers who are concerned that there are new people coming into New York, and they're rowdy. Clement Clark Moore is really concerned. He's got an estate that's called Chelsea. That is, if you just think about New York City, Chelsea was his estate, and Manhattan. So, and there are people that are breaking into his young men, especially at Christmas time, who are breaking into his under the grounds, taking down fences, and just being hooligans. So they're concerned about that, and they're also concerned about making New York City memorable. They're boosters. They want the trade to, they want that idea that this is going to be where the financial capital is. And so they're two things pushing. One is the influx of immigrants that often are unmarried young men and trying to find some order for them, and also to find something that makes New York City special. And so it's in New York City that we see this invention of this character who's most likely a Dutch version of the first Santa Clauses are most likely Dutch versions that John Pinter is really thinking about. Uh, there are some characters who run around is wrong. Uh, the Pennsylvania countryside, Bell's Nickel in fur, and they're ones who, in the Dutch tradition, would knock on doors and have children recite verses from the Bible. And if the children couldn't do that, they're carrying these Bellsnickels were carrying switches and would beat the children or leave coal. I mean, it's sad. We don't do that as Americans. And so there's this, they're all, in other words, there are all these strands of these folk characters, and they're pulled together into this character who is an interesting. He starts off to being sort of elf-like, and Steve Nissenbaum says he thinks that he's probably patterned on peddlers who would roam the countryside, and they'd open their sacks and they have all sorts of like wonderful things in them. Uh, and so you just keep recrafting this character, bring him into the city, and he becomes an urban folk tale. So he survives that way. Santa Claus survives that way, mostly carried along as poetry. And then Thomas Nast makes the official portrait of Santa Claus. And at first, he used Santa Claus as very pro-Union during the Civil War. But then the picture that's on the front of the book that you showed is Thomas Nast's portrait. I think it was done in 1870. And this is a bigger Santa Claus, and he doesn't have bishop's robes on him. That any sort of references to Europe, to Catholicism, to the past are really pretty much erased, and you really see a person who survives in the city, and he's got manufactured toys hanging over his arms, and he is a character that is really an American. He's an American figure. He's a folk figure for Americans.
I found that the link between the kind of Dutch tradition so interesting, and it makes sense because Washington Irving and Clement Clark Moore in New York, which was originally a Dutch colony, and so kind of that. It's so interesting how when we think about American history and American identity, we often forget that there was a Dutch colony within in the area that is now the United States, and that the figure of Santa Claus is kind of such a clear way in which those traditions were kind of taken up and maybe transformed in some ways, but that were kind of woven into the fabric of Americans trying to create a distinct American national identity.
And I think that need to create an American national identity is probably not as explicit, but that's definitely the result. In the case of Moore and Pinter and Washington Irving, they're looking for a way to put order on the city, and they're looking for commercial advantage. And there's an elitism that goes with what they're doing also. They are trying to impose their own idea of what should be on a group of people that, as you said, this starts off as a Dutch colony. And I think when New York was first founded, there were something like 18 languages that you could hear. And this is when it was just a tiny, tiny place. So I think that the times were a lot more chaotic than we tend to imagine. That there were a lot of people having their elbows out and wanting their own voices heard. And we've got a group of strong people who are religious and literary people and financial people who have an idea about creating a certain order. And Christmas is a very, I was thinking about this before we started to talk today, is that one of the things that Christmas does is it puts an order on a set of days. And it puts not a universal, but it does a cultural order to things. You do things in a certain order, there are certain expectations, and it's a way of imposing certain routines in a culture that is constantly receiving new members.
So I want to make sure I get in. Michael just had a very specific question about Clement Clark Moore's poem, and you mentioned earlier that it was published anonymously in New York City newspapers. Do we know anything about how the newspaper obtained it, or when his identity was known, or anything more about the source of that?
No. uh, Perhaps somebody else does, but it seems to have this same sort of mystical thing where he writes this poem and he's an Episcopal bishop. I mean, he should not be dabbling in this sort of thing. So you have this idea that he's making some things up, and he apparently is not really owning up to doing this. And the story is, that's all I can say, is the story is that some relative wrote it down because it was so charming, and uh, gave it to another newspaper, gave it to a newspaper, and that newspaper published it. And newspapers were constantly borrowing things from each other and republishing, because you've got to fill up space. So it gets circulated just as, oh, this is a good poem. Um, and I don't know at what point Moore ever claimed it specifically, but and there's a man whose name I think is Livingston. Some people say he wrote it, and and actually, it's Shakespeare or not, but we're not dealing in that quality of verse. I'm more interested, to me anyway, more interested in the carriage, the way in which the culture carries that message out, uh, and less so the person who wrote it. And if it's Clement Clark Moore, it seemed to be something he dashed off, the way that you might think of jingles in your family on the, in a big car trip somewhere. I made that up.
So another, I think, really important development in Christmas and the traditions of Christmas is gift giving, right? Which kind of, as you suggest, starts in the late or mid to late 19th century. And, I found it fascinating that even as early as 1861, New York City newspapers were writing saying, make sure you don't spend too much on gifts. Don't spend money that you don't have on gifts, which is, clearly such a contemporary issue a lot of us deal with when you see the credit card commercials in January. But is this kind of, if we're looking for when the commercialization of Christmas happens, is the beginning of gift giving and kind of raising gift giving up to to be an important part of Christmas, is that kind of where all of this starts?
I think that I think that this starts when America becomes a manufacturing nation. And somewhere I'd read 1880 is the date that America started to produce more than it could consume. Once that happens, once we've got department stores, which are just starting, maybe 1870s, we start to see several department stores. There's a wealth of goods out there. And it's almost logical that how do we get rid of these goods, because in order to produce more, you're going to have a lot of consumers. And so this is a convenient story. This idea of Christmas giving conveniently latches onto that. There are lots of discussions about people saying, well, how many gifts should we give? And how far out should this circle extend? There's this really wonderful exchange between Alexander Graham Bell and his wife, whose name was Mabel. about Christmas gifts. And she was like, we need to give gifts to everybody because that's that's how we maintain social fabrics, that you give to the person who is ironing the shirts, and you give to the child that's baking on the street, and you give to your children, and you give to your family, because gifts are ways of creating obligations to one another. It's social glue. And Alexander Graham Bell was just, this was uh, 2 or 3 letters that were rather extensive and a little bit heated, in which he was saying, no, people should only give things that they made with their own hands, which apparently you have a telephone. And if you've got a telephone that you made, you could give it. But Mabel Bell was out there spending a lot of money and keeping the networks alive. So that first you have to have abundance, you have to have goods to give, and then you have to have enough money that's circulating the economy so people can buy the gifts. And then you have to have that sense of probably dispersal, that so with the distance, well, then that's another way of, so we put Christmas cards into this too, that how do you maintain connections when America in the late 19th century is, the pace is picking up just an enormous sort of chaos is happening with the amount of change in America in the late 19th century. So you add all the immigrants, you add the uh, the expansion westward, you add urbanization, all the technology, all of these things are just making a lot of chaos, cultural chaos. And Christmas starts to become a way of ordering and keeping tabs on one another. And again, it's moving it out of so I'm not talking about religion much. Individuals, individual families, communities would be tied to religion, but as a cultural phenomenon, it starts to develop through, I would argue, primarily through commerce.
So for my last question, I want to make sure I bring it up to the present. And, so you're a kind of observer of Christmas, and you've written this book about the history of Christmas. And throughout it, as we've talked about, you stress how Christmas is continually being remade. Maybe either since you wrote the book or as you were writing the book. What do you think are some of the most kind of notable ways in which Christmas has been remade more recently?
Okay. One of the things, there's a mall down the road from me. And in the last 5 years, it is virtually undecorated. I mean, they've got a few cascades of white lights, but there are none of those enormous trees that have the gaudy decorations on them. So I'm starting to see one of the things is that Christmas seems to be losing some of its centrality in the public spaces. And some of this has to do with an understandable sort of way in which people are concerned about their own traditions and their own belief sets, and feeling, and they're and increasingly the space to voice opposition to celebrating what gets reduced to, and I'm going to say this very carefully, reduced to a Christian holiday. I mean, and why I'm saying reduced to is because it's never been a holiday that's been purely Protestant or purely Christian. I mean, you start with that Christmas tree, which is a pagan thing, or all that tinsel and glitter. There's an awful lot about it that has no roots whatsoever in Christianity, but it has carried, Christmas in America has been wedded to religion. And now that wedding to religion is reshaping what it looks like in public. I know increasingly at least students that I talk to are um, they and part of it's their age, but part of it too, it seems that when they have their families and their little kids, it's great fun with a bunch of little kids around. But if you don't have a bunch of kids around, it's just a lot of work. And it's, and increasingly too is that we, get on Amazon and say, I want that, and we charge it. We don't have to wait for that moment when someone's going to divine what we want and then wrap it up and give it to us at Christmas. If you want a sled, buy the sled today and you'll get it tomorrow or in 2 days. So that immediate gratification has taken that as well. So I'd say one thing is a recognition that we live in an increasingly diverse culture, and that we are also much more individual in our demands and don't want to take the time to wait for other people to figure out what we want or what's good for us. We know what's good for us, and we act on that, and that breaks apart those old social traditions, like which Christmas is a primary one.
But it speaks to this larger point, right, as you kind of suggested, of that the continuation maybe from the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, is that Christmas is continually remodeled for different generations.
I think it's of different importance to people in 1880 than it was in 1950 when everyone settled down into their Levittown home, as opposed to, I don't know, 1990, when we live in a culture that is more accepting of diversity. So we remake Christmas and its meaning as well, I think.
Well, that is, I think, a great note to end on. And I had some connection trouble on my end, but I hope no one else did. So Penny, I want to thank you again so much for being with us here today.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
And make sure, to those of you who are watching now or those of you who will watch later, to pick up January's selection, which is Pure and Modern Milk, An Environmental History Since 1900 by Kendra Smith Howard. So take good care, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.